In this last segment, we're going to take a quick look at the history of the expansion of Buddhism from India to the rest of the world. The first important figure here is the Emperor Ashoka, who flourished in the 200s BCE. Like many emperors, he expanded his kingdom through warfare. And Ashoka had a remarkably large kingdom when he was done expanding. He ended up ruling over about this much of India. Historians call this the Mauryan Empire. But at some point the emperor converts to Buddhism, and he repents of his war-making ways. And he ended up being the most important early promoter of Buddhism. He put a lot of energy into spreading it. In particular, he built numerous stupas and temples. Stupas were originally simple earth mounds that contained relics of the Buddha. Later on, they became brick structures and more complicated. Emperor Ashoka had the 8 original stupas opened up, and the remains of the Buddha that were in them distributed among several thousand stupas he had built. He built stupas all around the edge of his empire, possibly to protect it. He also sent out missionaries in all directions. He sent them to all over India. He sent missionaries down to the island nation that's now called Sri Lanka, and that became an important center of Buddhism from that point on. He sent missionaries eastward into China and into other nations, and he even sent missionaries far westward, where they reached Africa and Europe. And in this way, Buddhism became more than an Indian religion. In China, Buddhism got off to a bit of a slow start. It arrived no later than the year 65, Common Era. But you see, the Chinese already had Chinese religions, and they didn't think they needed this foreign religion brought into China. At that time, the Confucian and the Taoist traditions were already hundreds of years old. Centuries later, of course, Confucianism and Taoism were combined with Chinese versions of Buddhism, and that became what scholars today call traditional Chinese religion. In many cases, Chinese people will say that they're Buddhist for government purposes. But what they in fact practice is a uniquely Chinese blend of those 3 different traditions, a blend which isn't found in any other country. Buddhism slowly increased in China, especially during times of social unrest, which were many. One major event happened in the year 401 CE. In that year, an Indian Buddhist monk named Kumarajiva was captured by pirates, and those pirates sold him into slavery, and he spent the rest of his life in the Chinese capital. And he ended up being an important force in the spread of Buddhism to China. He ended up leading some 300 scholars in translating the Mahayana scriptures of Buddhism, which we'll talk about in a future lecture. He ended up translating the Mahayana sutras into Chinese from Sanskrit. This was a foundational event in the history of Chinese Buddhism, and it helped to form part of the Chinese canon of Buddhist scriptures. Buddhism in China underwent some cycles of persecution, but it enjoyed what historians consider to be a golden age during the Sui dynasty, which was founded by the Emperor Wen. The Sui dynasty lasted from 581 to 845. Emperor Wen, too, just like Ashoka, sent out missionaries. During this time, Buddhism spread from China to Korea and Japan. I won't talk about the history of Buddhism in China and Japan other than to say this. In both places, Buddhism underwent cycles of official favor and official persecution. Buddhism almost died out in Japan in the 19th century, but was revived and is very popular there now. And forms of Buddhism still thrive in Korea, that is, in South Korea. Back to China. Buddhism took an enormous hit in China during the Chairman Mao era, which lasted from 1949 to 1976. Chairman Mao was a famous and powerful communist dictator of China, and he initiated an event in China called the Cultural Revolution, which lasted from 1966 to 1976. The Cultural Revolution was a kind of purge of forces within Chinese society that were viewed as not fitting in well with the goals of the communist leaders. During these years, then, they persecuted a lot of different religions, including Buddhism. Here you can see a Chinese propaganda poster from 1967, which reads, "Destroy the old world, forge the new world." And you can see the Red Guard crushing with a big hammer a crucifix, a symbol of Christianity, a Buddha statue, and also classical Chinese texts, the kind of texts that were part of the Confucian and Taoist traditions. The view that prevailed of religion during this time was the Marxist view, which we'll talk about again in a future lecture. because it's so important to understanding the 20th century. This attempt to almost get rid of Buddhism has changed drastically in recent years. Buddhism is now seen by the Chinese government as a part of the Chinese heritage. But let's turn from China back to the other giant of Asia, back to India. We've seen that Buddhism was born in India, but you should remember from Unit 1 of this class that there are hardly any Buddhists in India today. By far the biggest religions in India are Hinduism and Islam. A distant third and fourth place to those are Christianity and Sikhism. And Buddhists are less than 1%. So what happened? What happened was that Buddhism died out in India between the years 900 and 1100, Common Era. Why did it die out? Well, that's something that scholars dispute about. Some would urge that this was due to an Islamic Holocaust, that Islamic rulers extinguished Buddhism by persecution and violence. Others reject this, though. They point out that religions like Jainism and Hinduism were also part of India and thus were occupied by Islamic rulers in the Middle Ages, but they didn't die out. Classical Islamic governments, as we'll see in Unit 5 of this class, have a way of both tolerating and slowly choking out other religions, but these religions survived up until the present day. So what happened? It seems that basically Buddhism in India was outcompeted by Hinduism. One way that Buddhism had held on was by being supported by elites and by governments, and it hadn't thrived among the general populace as much as Hinduism had. When governments then started to support Hinduism officially, then Buddhism just couldn't be maintained. Moving on to Tibet, there was a religion already in Tibet. Scholars now call it the Bon religion. Buddhism started to move in the 6th century Common Era, so in the 500s. There were other later waves of Buddhism as well, but this was the first and perhaps most important one. Tibetan Buddhism followed Indian rather than Chinese Buddhism, and they kind of combined it with Bon practices and with Tantric practices found in the Tantric stream of Hinduism. Scholars call the unique blend of Buddhism that resulted from that Lamaism, and there are two branches, two lineages here. There are the Dalai Lamas and the Panchen Lamas. These are slightly different and competing lineages of religious leaders. Those two sects of Buddhism in Tibet competed with each other and with many other sects for power. The victory was handed to the Dalai Lamas in the 1600s by a Mongol chieftain that was ruling the land. You may not have realized that the Dalai Lamas were an entire lineage, but you've probably heard of this guy. The Dalai Lama, who was born Tenzin Gyatso in the year 1935, is probably the most popular and beloved religious leader in the world, or maybe he's second place to the Pope. And of course, the Dalai Lama has evolved into a kind of spokesman for any kind of Buddhism in the world. He's grown to be far more than just a leader of Tibetan Buddhism. One of the reasons why the Dalai Lama is so famous is what happened to him in 1959. In 1959, the Chinese Communist government decided that they really owned Tibet, that Tibet should be considered part of China, that they had a historical claim to it. So they just annexed the country. They just took it. When they did that, the Dalai Lama and his people fled into exile. They fled across the border into India, and they're still there. The Dalai Lama and many other people, including some notable celebrities in America, have been justifiably complaining about this occupation of Tibet by China. China doesn't want to hear it, and they're actively populating the land with ethnically Han Chinese people so as to better integrate it into the rest of China. The United States and many other countries have taken the Tibetan side and sided with the Dalai Lama, but to no avail. Meanwhile, the Chinese have installed their own favored leaders of Buddhism within Tibet. Traditional Tibetan Buddhists believe that there's really only been one Dalai Lama who has been reincarnated some 14 times, and they also believe that this same being is Avalokiteshvara, one of the popular bodhisattvas from Indian Buddhism, in Tibetan called Chenrezig. We'll talk about what a bodhisattva is in a coming lecture. For now, suffice it to say that a bodhisattva is a spiritually advanced being, which is almost a Buddha. Avalokiteshvara is the Buddha of infinite compassion, and interestingly enough, even though he's a male bodhisattva in Indian and Tibetan Buddhism, in Chinese Buddhism, Avalokiteshvara is a female. This is the same Bodhisattva that's called Guanyin in China. It was really only in the 20th century that through emigration and also increasing information spreading abroad about Buddhism, about Buddhist teachings, that Buddhism became a world religion. It was only in the 20th century that it spread much beyond the bounds of South Asia and East Asia. Now Buddhism is represented in every major city in North America, Africa, Europe, South America, and its growth is fueled both by immigration and by conversion from other religions or from no religion to Buddhism. So early in its history, Buddhism was an aggressive missionary religion that energetically expanded throughout South Asia and then East Asia, but it slowed down over the years. And it took it really until about the end of the 19th century to start to really penetrate the Western world. Since around the last 2 decades of the 19th century, Buddhism has been very popular among Western elites. Some of them have converted to Buddhism. Others led the way in translating and studying the Buddhist scriptures. In the 20th century, Buddhism has been spread to the West by a whole series of very charismatic Asian teachers. We could mention various Zen scholars that came to America after World War II from Japan. But here we'll just mention this man, the Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh, born in 1926. And he teaches what's called socially engaged Buddhism. He actually knew Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. back in the day and participated in anti-war protests. And socially engaged Buddhism is really focused on this life. It's focused on gaining inner peace and peace of mind, but in a way so as to enable you to better improve the world around you. Very often these charismatic, very appealing Asian teachers who are promoting Buddhism in the West are promoting what you could call a demythologized version of Buddhism. This is a very modern, very non-supernatural form of Buddhism. They'll very often say that Buddhism isn't really a religion, it's just a science of the mind. They downplay the devotional side of Buddhism, the teaching about reincarnation or rebirth, the mantras, the other magical practices from Tantrism, and so on. Some of them present it as basically just helpful psychological techniques to help you cope with living. Well, this is a version of Buddhism. It's what some scholars call Buddhist modernism or modernist Buddhism. And there have been some interesting books written about it. All I have to say about it right here, and this is just an observation, not a criticism, is that it doesn't bear much resemblance to Buddhism as practiced historically in Asia over many centuries. Some scholars believe that this modernist approach to Buddhism really has its origin in some of the Western promoters of it. But then it seems that Easterners eagerly embraced it as well and realized that this was an excellent way to market Buddhism in the West. And it's marketed fairly well. We'll talk a bit more about this when we get into the details of Buddhist doctrine.